You're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and pursue the truth with FBI whistleblowers and founding suspendables Garrett O'Boyle and Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast on a Thursday, episode 202. Excited to be here. It's 10:30 Eastern Time on the Eastern Seaboard. We are streaming live on rumble.com/amradpod. If you have not already, please give us a thumbs up. Follow the program. If you want to subscribe, we really appreciate that. Definitely subscribe to the audio format on iTunes and Spotify, iHeart, whatever your platform of choice is. Help us to grow and radicalize more Americans there. Today's a very special episode. Today's the day you're going to want to bookmark. You might want to go back and watch or listen again. You definitely need to share with a friend. You know, growing up, every little boy wants to be the stud athlete. We all want to be Don Larson in the World Series, throwing that perfect game. We want to be Joe Montana coming into the huddle for the 2-minute drill in the Super Bowl and being just so cool, calm, and collected that you point out that John Candy is sitting in the front row. You want to be Mark Messier, captain of the New York Rangers, trying to bring that franchise a Stanley Cup championship, guaranteeing victory in the Eastern Conference Finals and scoring 3 goals in support of that victory. Now, I was never really an athletic stud, but I was really good as an investigator. And I had a couple of opportunities where I walked in, looked at the police officers who I was working with, and said, I'm going to go ahead and get that confession for you. And I was able to deliver. Those are some of the most proud moments of my career as a special agent with the FBI and in law enforcement in general. Today is one of those days. I'm riding solo today at GOB Actual. Garrett O'Boyle has the week off. And I wanted to bring you a deep dive that I have done hours of research on the revelations that we got, the declassification of this document from the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard handed over, about how the Biden administration set out a plan to go after the American people as domestic terrorists. Now, I've done a lot of work on it, and I've got a lot of receipts for it. I want to bring it to you because this is a massive news story. This is the reason that the American Radicals Podcast exists, to interpret this information, to give it to you, to break it down in a digestible way. And I am stoked to bring it to everyone today. But before we do that, we had to put a couple of episodes in the can, so I wasn't able to respond over the Easter weekend. Garrett's been out of town for a couple of days. We had a Rumble Rant come in, and we are nothing if not the most grateful on earth to this audience. And I need to acknowledge one, Peaches62, who gave us this over the holiday weekend. She gave us a Rumble Rant, says, just say no. Have a blessed Easter, everybody. Peaches, we love you. We love how you got your own credit card now, not necessarily relying on slipping husbands out of his wallet in order to support the show. But we're grateful for your support and for everybody in the audience. So let's get to it, because I'm calling today the Rosetta Stone, because we got the playbook. The actual playbook that they used over the last 4 years. And we're going to give you lots of examples. But before I do that, I got to give you another little piece, because for a while now, I've been preparing shows and I've had one in reserve, and I didn't have enough meat on the bone. When they interview the football coach before the Super Bowl, that coach doesn't typically give you the X's and O's that he's planning to use in order to win the game. They'll ask, well, coach, what's your strategy for the game? And he'll say something like, well, we're going to need to have a balanced run attack when pass attack. And hopefully we'll be able to hold on to the football and score some points. And on defense, we're just going to have to hold our own and hopefully keep them out of the end zone. That's not enough. It's really not the playbook that you want. It's not like he opened up and gave you exactly the scripted plays that he has for his opening drive. So for a while now, I've had that coach speak. And I've been waiting in order to get more information on it. And I think I can finally connect it to what we're going to get into today. But the coach speak was this document, which I've held on to for almost the entire duration of the podcast at this point. It's a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. It sounds a lot like what the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, handed over to the American people last week. And this one just sort of gives vague ideas out there. It does lay out that they have 4 pillars, which we'll see from the classified document, which is now declassified, to understand and share domestic terrorism related information, prevent domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization, disrupt and deter domestic terrorism activity, confront long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. But really, by and large, it's just kind of weak sauce. So in order to get this revelation that we got, this came from the Director's Initiatives Group, the DIG, a declassified strategic implementation plan for countering domestic terrorism from the Biden administration. We finally now have the playbook that was used. So without further ado, what I was able to do, guys, is pull out some excerpts from this document. This document is not particularly long. It's now public. You can access it if you want it. Put it actually in the show notes so you can pull it up easily. And I pulled out certain excerpts, and they will seem familiar to you if you've been paying attention for the last couple of years, particularly in light of the weaponization that we saw on behalf of the federal government. So I'm just going to throw up some excerpts that I was able to pull, and we will digest them and speak to them from our own experience. So without further ado, let's go to the first one. This reports Section 1, continue to develop and implement more robust public reporting on federal domestic terrorism related prosecutions, increase federal agent engagement, and support for public reporting by state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement partners on all domestic terrorism related prosecutions. Now, it does sound a lot like government speak, but fortunately for you on the American Radicals podcast, we speak fluent government speak. So what does that really mean? Well, I can think of this particular example that we saw from the human Roomba when he was sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. This was Joe Biden when he was giving an address at a historically Black college at the commencement at his perspectives on the greatest threats to the homeland. Let's give old Joe a play.
We know that American history has not always been a fairy tale. From the start, it's been a constant push and pull for more than 240 years between the best of us, the American ideal that we're all created equal, and the worst of us, a harsh reality that racism has long torn us apart. It's a battle that's never really over. But on the best days, enough of us have the guts and the hearts to stand up for the best in us, to choose love over hate, unity over disunion, progress over retreat, to stand up against the poison of white supremacy, as I did in my inaugural address, to single out as the most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy.
White supremacy is the most dangerous threat to the homeland. That's per the former president of the United States of America. And Joe Biden asserted this in front of this historically Black college with no evidence to support it, but he kind of did have evidence to support it because the FBI, the Department of Justice, they were manipulating the statistics. They were taking things like a guided tour of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And look, I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek. There was clearly violence that day. I'm not issuing any more qualifiers because you know what? Every one of them was pardoned. The federal government now standpoint is January 6th is not a crime. Now, some people engaged in violence against cops and property destruction. Should they have been prosecuted? Likely. But by and large, most people there were there exercising their First Amendment right according to the Constitution of the United States, the First Amendment, which says you have the right, the God-given right to assemble. You have the God-given right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. And people did that. They wanted their voices heard. And as a result of that, as a result of this Joe Biden administration effort on countering domestic terrorism, where they had to artificially create domestic terrorism, the FBI followed suit and labeled 2,400 people as domestic terrorists, anti-government extremists, and derivative of that, they called them racially motivated violent extremists because they said they were white supremacists, even though they disagreed with the election outcome and they had problems with the certification of it. And it was an election outcome between two white guys. Kind of nonsensical. Now I'll move over to another one that we got from this handover that we got from Tulsi Gabbard at the DNI. Continue to develop and implement more robust public reporting and federal DT-related prosecutions, increase federal engagement and support for public reporting by state, local, tribal. And I've read that one already. We're going to go to this one. Sorry, guys. Next one. Explore ways to enhance the identification and analysis of financial activity associated with domestic terrorists and related or similar threats abroad, as well as enhancing engagement with financial institutions on domestic terrorist financing, including through existing provisions of the Bank Secrecy Act. When I saw Bank Secrecy Act, it made me think of some of the older episodes that we had. It also made me think of my buddy, George Hill. So first to George Hill. George Hill, retired supervisory intelligence analyst from the FBI, also worked at the NSA, the United States Marine Corps, United States Navy. Guy has 35 years with an actual security clearance, did the real work. And his whistleblower disclosure, the big one that he brought forward to the Weaponization Committee, was the fact that Bank of America had colluded with the FBI, with the federal government. Now, Bank of America, on its own initiative, assembled a list of clients of Bank of America who used a debit card, a credit card in the general Washington, D.C. area on January 6th. And they thought, well, this will be helpful to the federal government, who hasn't presented us with a subpoena or a search warrant. We're just going to be good partners and hand this over, because those vile, vicious insurrectionists, as they like to call them, and they handed that list over, but that wasn't enough. They actually curated that information. And they said, well, because there's so many people that use Bank of America, that's probably not going to be too helpful. But what do we know about these racially motivated violent extremists, as they were characterized, white supremacists? They might be supporters of the Second Amendment. So now we have used our First Amendment and the Second Amendment. That's a problem. That makes you a potential domestic terrorist. So Bank of America curated its data and handed over a list of people who not only used a Bank of America debit card or credit card, but people who had in earlier times purchased a firearm, because that made them more likely, as an indicator, to be who the federal government, the FBI, was going after. Now, I mentioned the Bank Secrecy Act. Bank Secrecy Act, we have talked about on this podcast before. It was episode 152. It was called The Banking Threat. And we got a piece here from the Free Press. It was talking about the debanking of America. But before we do that, let's go over to a hit from the Joe Rogan show, where they talked about how individuals have been debanked by the federal government. This is a pretty disturbing one from a couple months ago.
So debanking is when you as either a person or your company are literally kicked out of the banking system.
Like they did to Kanye.
Exactly, like they did to Kanye. My partner Ben's father has been debanked.
Really?
We had an employee who
for what?
For having the wrong politics, for saying unacceptable things. Under current banking regulations, here's a great thing. Under current banking regulations, after all the reforms of the last 20 years, there's now a category called a politically exposed person, PEP. And if you are a PEP, you are required by financial regulators to kick them off of your to kick them out of your bank. You're not allowed to have them.
What if you're politically on the left?
Well, that's fine.
No,
because they're not politically exposed.
So no one on the left gets debanked?
No, I have not heard of a single instance of anybody on the left getting debanked.
Can you tell me what the person that you know did, what they said that got them debanked?
Oh, well, I mean, David Horowitz is a right wing. He's pro-Trump. I mean, he's said all kinds of things. He's been very anti-Islamic terrorism. He's been very worried about migration, all these things.
And they debanked him for that.
Yeah, they debanked him. So you get kicked out of your bank account. You get kicked out of you can't do credit card transactions. But, by the way, you can't.
How is that legal?
Well, exactly. So this is the thing, and then you go into this thing of like, well, this is where the government and the companies get intertwined. Back to your fascism point, which is there's a constitutional amendment that says the government can't restrict your speech, but there's no constitutional amendment that says the government can't debank you.
And he mentioned there, if you caught it, the fact that there is an element of fascism, collusion between the federal government and private industry, the banking industry here. So I mentioned the Free Press. This is an entire piece about this issue, the debanking of America, which we covered in episode 152. This is from October of last year. Now, elements of this one got into what debanking is and what de-risking is. Debanking is, some financial institutions prefer, they called it de-risking so that it sounds more palatable. It refers to a bank cutting ties with a customer deemed politically incorrect, extreme, dangerous, or otherwise out of bounds. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act, which was mentioned in this DNI declassified document, sharply limits the rights of citizens to financial privacy and protection and bars banks from disclosing their reasons for severing ties to customers. So if you get debanked and you ask Bank of America or Wells Fargo, what the heck is going on? The law says they don't have to let you know. They're just de-risking after all. And furthermore, the Patriot Act mandated that banks collect more data on their customers, which would sort of explain why Bank of America, through a system of fascism, because that is collusion between private industry and the government, was able to curate your information if you happen to be a customer of Bank of America and use your bank product in the Washington, D.C. area in the days before, days after January 6, 2021. And you also happen to use that very same instrument to purchase a firearm, which is perfectly legal. But they collect that information and just handed it right over. Move on over. Now, this one is from the next pillar. The U.S. government improves the visibility and accessibility of federal resources related to DT prevention, DT being domestic terrorism. Highlight federal resources and partnerships related to domestic terrorism and targeted violence prevention through senior level public engagement, press engagements, targeted advertisement campaigns, and resource sharing with local partners. Now, it's very government speak. It's basically meaning we need the principals. We need the high level people within the federal government to go out there and message that the risk of domestic terrorism is on the rise throughout the entire country. And, I couldn't think of any better example than the general, the former Attorney General of the United States of America, Merrick Garland, who stood at the lectern and very much like Joe Biden messaged how domestic terrorism and was connected to white supremacy. And that was on the rise because of the very cases that his department was manipulating in order to get that very same talking point. Here is Merrick Garland talking like an 80-year-old woman.
During President Biden's first week in office, he directed the administration to undertake an assessment of the domestic terrorism threat and then to use that assessment to develop the national strategy being released today. Our intelligence and law enforcement agencies undertook that assessment in the first several weeks of this administration. In March, they concluded that domestic violent extremists posed an elevated threat to the homeland in 2021. Our experience on the ground confirms this. The number of open FBI domestic terrorism investigations this year has increased significantly. According to an unclassified summary of the March intelligence assessment, the two most lethal elements of the domestic violence extremist threat are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia violent extremists. In the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
Now, what were the assessments that the Attorney General of the United States was relying upon in order to come to the conclusion that we had a white supremacy problem in the United States of America? Well, lucky for you here in the American Radicals podcast, you have an FBI whistleblower who blew the whistle about this very exact thing. What the FBI did in the aftermath of January 6th in order to artificially inflate its number of domestic terrorism cases and connect it to white supremacy was take January 6th, which was an incident that occurred in Washington, D.C., should have been the responsibility of the Washington field office. It's within their area of responsibility. They should have had one case open. But instead, the FBI elected to open a separate case for every single individual who it could identify in the area who they wanted to investigate, which wound up being over 2,000 Americans. They opened a separate case, so we turned one case into 2,000. But that wasn't good enough because people could easily attribute that to one incident in one place. If we want to create the false narrative that the greatest threat to the homeland, not just Washington, D.C., that the greatest threat to the homeland is domestic terrorism connected to racially motivated violent extremists, connected to white supremacy, is we take those over 2,000 cases and we say that they're anti-government extremists, but they're really white supremacists, even though, again, it was an election between two white guys. And we open those cases in the field offices around the country for wherever the person lived. So if you lived in Orlando and you happen to go to the Capitol, J6 2021, now you're a domestic terrorist, white supremacist, living in FBI Tampa's area of responsibility. We've jacked up the stats, and now we have the talking point, and we can send out a principal like Merrick Garland, Attorney General, a member of the presidential cabinet, to message this and have the charts and the data and the assessments who were drafted by politically partisan members of the Department of Justice and the FBI in order to backfill and justify what went on those days. And it's just not limited to January 6th. It's just the perfect summation of what went on. We'll come off of this one, but I do want to get back to, for a minute, the financial angle to this. And back to, again, the fact that we've talked about this before on the American Radicals podcast. This was reporting from the Daily Signal, and it was about the financial angles and how the federal government colludes with the banking industry, the Bank Secrecy Act, just through generalized fascism in order to target people for their First Amendment protected activity, reporting from the Daily Signal. This was from March of a year ago. Financial Crimes Agency, that's FinCEN, suggests banks close the accounts of conservative, quote, hate groups. Now, what conservative hate groups could they possibly be referring to? Well, according to this article from Daily Signal, the groups included the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a legal aid group that defended Jack Phillips. He's the baker from Colorado who didn't want to bake the gay wedding cake. The Liberty Counsel, Matt Staver, who's argued, I believe, close to 10 times in front of the Supreme Court, and they primarily focus on religious liberty, and they went really hard into the coronavirus tyranny. There was also the Family Research Council, which lobbies in Washington, D.C. for pro-family policies like traditional marriage and not murdering babies, and also the American College of Pediatricians, who opposed transgenderism and abortion. Seems like those are all First Amendment protected activities, and yet FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, this is under the Department of the Treasury, targeted those individuals and said they were extremists who should be debanked. Now, coming to the next one, which is from this, again, the ODNI, the Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence. Tulsi Gabbard last week declassified this document. It's only 15 pages. Put it in the show notes. If you want to access it, you'll be able to read it for yourself. But lucky for you, you have the government whisperer here in the form of real Steve Friend. Now, Pillar 2, channel funding towards research on the effectiveness of digital literacy programming, improve sharing of such research across the interagency with local partners. And that's through USAID, by the way, and Department of Homeland Security, Department of Education. Facilitate development of evidence-based digital literacy programming by relevant agencies and local partners through grants, training, and technical assistance opportunities. Digital literacy. What does that even mean? That's misinformation. That's disinformation. Who remembers how Department of Homeland Security stood up this Ministry of Disinformation? There was a young lady who had an affinity for singing Mary Poppins songs, who they put as its czar, and it was quickly found out, and it went away, sort of, but we actually have talked about it before, how there were notes upon these meetings that this group was having, and they've just done the whack-a-mole. They've come about again as another organization, but it is worth playing just because it's fun. This is Nina Jankowicz, who was supposed to be in charge of this Ministry of Disinformation.
Laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origins are slightly less atrocious. It's how you hide a little lie, little lie. It's how you hide a little lie, little lie. It's how you hide a little lie, little lie. When Rudy Giuliani shared bad intel from Ukraine, or when TikTok influencers say COVID can cause pain. They're laundering disinfo and we really should take note and not support their lies with our wallet, voice or vote. Oh, information laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origin seems slightly less atrocious.
Woo! Woo, indeed, from Miss Jankowicz. Man, she's got a set of pipes on her, doesn't she? You actually paid attention to what she's saying, though. She's saying that you shouldn't support people's political opinions. You should actually suppress them, because we have the three main categories. We have misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation, for those who don't know, is erroneous information that is given kind of by mistake. Disinformation is information that is false and purposely given so, both of which are completely legal, by the way. You can report on things that aren't true, as we see from the New York Times, allegedly at one point a newspaper, or the Washington Post, because democracy dies in darkness. They report on things all the time. They get win Pulitzers for reporting on things that didn't happen, like Russia, where the federal government colluded with Hillary Clinton in order to spy on Donald Trump's campaign and actually malign the first few years of his presidency. Those journalists, big J journalists, won Pulitzer Prizes for the reporting on that, and they still haven't given it back, even though that information is false. And then the last category is malinformation. Malinformation is actually factually accurate. It's just inconvenient for the Nina Jankowiczes of the world. Things like, maybe coronavirus didn't emerge from a bat that nested 600 miles away from a wet market in Wuhan, China, that flew, didn't stop along the way at all. It landed in the wet market, gnawed on a pangolin. The pangolin puked into a bowl of soup, and then some sort of citizen ate the soup. That was the most likely origin. Or it could have been the bioweapons lab run by a bioweapons expert who might have had a accidental leak or a purposeful leak, whatever you have there. If you proffered that early on, the Nina Jankowiczes of the world for years on end pushed to eliminate your ability to speak freely, to actually deplatform you or isolate you, put you in sort of a digital gulag. So you were just talking into the ether and you could say whatever you wanted. You had free speech after all. Nobody saw it, though. There was collusion between the federal government and social media companies in order to do that. We saw no greater example than Elvis Chan manipulating social media companies in order to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story that Miranda Devine broke in the New York Post in the lead up to the 2020 election. That was true and accurate. The FBI actually had Hunter Biden's laptop in evidence. They used the laptop to eventually prosecute him for the gun crime in Delaware. Of course, he was pardoned for that. That was facts in evidence that the FBI could confirm. And yet, the CIA orchestrated a 51 spies who lie letter signed by members of the intelligence community saying that the Hunter Biden laptop story had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Even though it has the hallmarks, it was fair and accurate, and the FBI, member of the intelligence community, didn't utter a word to refute it. And in fact, they mobilized Elvis Chan, the assistant special agent in charge in San Francisco, to go to social media companies and tell them that they should suppress that information because it was likely inaccurate. They felt free to do that. Now, I want to go back to Nina Jankowicz just for a minute, because I said they play whack-a-mole. This Department of Homeland Security disinformation board went away in name only. It'll reemerge when we have a President Newsom, American psycho, some other person of his ilk will, I'm sure, bring something like that back. And Nina Jankowicz is just waiting in the weeds. She's actually working for this other organization now called the American Sunlight Project. Sunlight is the best disinfectant after all. So Nina Jankowicz, his first action at this group was to send a letter to Congress, to the Republicans, objecting to their efforts to thwart research into disinformation. So the Republicans wanted to fund some sort of a study that said, is this disinformation real? And she said, no, it's not real at all. The letter does not provide a single example of anti-misinformation research being misconstrued. It does claim that the vast majority of researchers who are being criticized for stifling speech are women, and that they face gendered, sexualized, violent rhetoric as a result. So relying on some sort of genitals, saying that I'm put upon. What I'm doing is not fundamentally evil or wrong or out of step with our constitutional republic, out of step with our Bill of Rights, out of step with the DNA of this country. Suppressing free speech is totally, completely, and wholly appropriate. But if you criticize me for doing that, well, then you're just a misogynist. Now back to examples coming from this declassified document. Comes from the dig at the Directorate of National Intelligence. Tulsi Gabbard finally turned it over, and it got a little bit of attention and then quickly passed away from the spotlight of another excerpt. Develop awareness training for active service military members, DoD employees and contractors, and those service members separating or retiring from the military on the threat posed by domestic terrorism, the potential targeting of those military training by violent extremist actors, and relevant reporting mechanisms. Continue exploring opportunities for joint training and finding a common understanding of the respective legal framework for each department in identifying and countering domestic terrorism threats. So essentially, the presumption here from the Biden administration when they drafted this document was that members of our armed forces, people who stood up after signing the dotted line, raised their hand and swore to God to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They were prime targets to become domestic terrorists, to be recruited as one. And which is why you get something like this story, which got some good attention for maybe a day or two, which was reported in this one from Fox News. Lawmakers ripped the Army over training slides suggesting pro-life groups could be tied to terrorism because we had to train the troops to know what the true threat is out there. Sort of reminiscent of my experience here at the FBI when we were sat down and received very specific training. We actually had to watch a movie that was created by the Southern Poverty Law Center. No political agenda from them whatsoever, of course. And in that training, they listed pro-life individuals as a greater threat to the homeland than radical jihadists. But what did the military see? Well, fortunately, because of a whistleblower, we were able to get an image of what they saw. This is a slide. Terrorist groups, National Right to Life, Operation Rescue, New York license plate, I'm for it, choose life. This was training that the DoD created and provided to soldiers for 7 years. 7 years of training. Didn't catch any attention at all. Nobody decided to come forward. Nobody recognized that this probably is out of step with what a constitutional republic that is supposed to protect individuals' rights to express themselves. It says it in the First Amendment, but very much like communists do, they found the institutions and they wormed their way into them. We don't have to represent all of the military. I mean, most of the military still trends relatively conservative, but they do have a follow order sort of default setting. And what the communists around the Joe Biden administration realized that they could do, and this actually started before the Biden administration, but it just got ramped up, was that, well, we can control human resources. The most communist member of any organization comes into human resources because they realize that that's a choke point. They can facilitate training of individuals and they can indoctrinate them. They can craft the way that personnel are selected so that we stop picking those conservative people, those people that really appreciate the fact that we can have a gun in America. We don't want them anymore. We want to actually isolate and select people who want to tear down all of our institutions and give them the guns and give them the power, which is why when Joe Biden is ever asked as president about any sort of resistance to people and people's resistance to just hand over their weapons to the government, he said, well, you can't take down our government with an AR-15. We've got F-15s. He fetishized flying sortie missions over Americans. And he did it multiple times, not just when he was senile. Now, this military labeled pro-life groups as terrorists. Nonprofits also included PETA, which they like animals more than people, but they were still included in this. And the slides were used on 9,000 soldiers over 7 years. The process was started and it continued. The next example from the ODNI declassification, still in Pillar 2, update the federal government's, quote, mobilization indicators booklet to include potential indicators of mobilization to domestic terrorism. What is the mobilization indicators booklet? Lucky for you, I'm a trained investigator. I went and found it. Here's a really cool picture of the U.S. violent extremist mobilization indicators from the 2021. Some nice, very red background there. Looks like a shattered bullet riddled glass. I love the use of the word extremist too, which doesn't really mean anything because, as members of this audience know, Real Estate Friend is sort of an extremist. I run long distances and generally just eat one almond a day. That's what the lore at least says. That would make me an extremist, but it sounds really, really choice and dangerous, which is perfect for the communists who want to control the narrative. So I actually looked through this booklet and found some things that were updated as a result of this plan to counter domestic terrorism. And I bullet pointed several of them. Pull it down. Traveling within the United States or abroad to carry out or participate in a violent extremist activity. Doesn't really say things that are illegal. I mean, violent maybe has a little bit of that, but we'll give them a little pass on that one. How about unusual purchase of military style tactical equipment such as body armor or personal protective equipment? So if you buy a kit like my buddy George Hill and you like to go rock or walk backwards through the wilderness, that could be an indicator that you're a domestic terrorist. You wouldn't want to have body armor. I mean, why would you ever need to be your own first responder? Certainly, when seconds count, the police are minutes away after all. Increased use of online concealment tactics. Do you use Signal? WhatsApp? Why are you doing that? We need to know these things. We're the government after all. Change in or initiation of physical or weapons training. This was something that was criticized by Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, who advocates for people to live a healthy lifestyle, to exercise and eat right. Well, that's based. That's right-wing extremist. Parenthetically, it's probably anti-government extremist. It's probably racially motivated violent extremist. At the very least, it's misogynist and it's anti-woman for you to want to get in shape and exercise your Second Amendment right to use a firearm. And I've said this, and I will continue to say it, and I will never stop saying it. The reason we have a Second Amendment in this country is not to protect your house from a robber. It's not to go hunting for prairie dogs in South Dakota. Thank you very much, Senate Majority Leader John Thune. You have a Second Amendment because if you don't, the government will come to your house and blast you in the face. Other bullet points from this, what do we call it? The Mobilization Indicators booklet. Expressing a willingness to die for a violent extremist ideology. Well, they would call being pro-life a violent extremist ideology. You're trying to thwart a woman from exercising her rights to murder her baby. Producing, promoting, or extensively consuming violent extremist content online or in person. So if you make a video saying that you shouldn't murder your baby, posing with weapons and imagery associated with violent extremism in photos or videos. How many pictures have we seen of Congressman Thomas Massie posing with his long gun? Increasing or extreme adherence to conspiracy theories. Well, if Nina Jankowicz has her say, saying that coronavirus originated in a lab or masks don't work, that's a conspiracy theory. That's an indicator of mobilization towards domestic terrorism. The last one I got, isolating oneself from family and peers, particularly if citing violent extremist doctrine or ideology. If you don't like Aunt Karen because she's got blue hair and she thinks that if you don't want to cut the balls off of your little boy because he says he feels pretty today, you don't want to have Thanksgiving dinner with Karen, you're isolating yourself. That's an indicator. You should probably report that person to the government. The next one that I have from this rundown of the DNI declassification. A little bit longer. We're still in Pillar 2, by the way. The U.S. government will appropriately engage with multilateral fora, such as the relevant UN Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact entities, Quintet 5 Country Ministerial, Justice Home Affairs Ministerial, and the Global Counterterrorism Forum. Basically, they want you to be okay with the United States government partnering with global organizations in order to counter what they deem to be the threat to the homeland. Now, that last one caught my eye, the Global Counterterrorism Forum. So I did a little research on them, pull up their website, and what immediately caught my attention was that they have these working groups and initiatives that they can't wait to tell you about. And one of the first ones that I saw when I scrolled through was this one. This is actually an article from April 15th of this year, this month, guys. Understanding the risk of climate change's relationship with violent extremism conducive to terrorism and building solutions. So we're going to go with the climate pagans and connect the dots, because that's what communists do. It's a religion of malcontents, which is how you get people claiming that they stand for your ability to chop off your genitals, and they want to partner with Hamas any way to fracture a society. Now, this article here has an interesting comment about climate crisis. Climate crises and fragility are ongoing matters of concern for millions of people worldwide. Beyond the impact of the planet itself, climate change affects livelihoods and security, creating vulnerabilities and posing challenges to governance. I mean, after all, if the temperature goes up, how will they govern you? A growing matter of international concern, these vulnerabilities may be exploited by violent extremist terrorist groups to further destabilize communities. That makes zero sense at all, other than the fact that we're going to be intersectional from this globalist group. Now, there was another partner, and this was back to the episode 152, the banking threat that we did here. And we did a deep dive on the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and Global Information Index. I'll pull this up because we've actually grown quite a bit in the last 50 or so episodes here. The ISD Institute for Strategic Dialogue. They wrote this document that was handed over to the United States Treasury Department under the Joe Biden administration, and the Treasury Department proliferated it around to various banking institutions. This document, as you can see there, says bankrolling bigotry, an overview of online funding strategies for American hate groups. This is not an American organization, by the way. It's a globalist organization, but they wanted to do a deep dive on how American hate groups like the Anti-Defamation League, like the groups that are defending against coronavirus tyranny or saying that not murdering babies is probably a good thing. They need to stop bankrolling. So what are the details here? As we covered in 152, but it's worth deep dive. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, that's FinCEN, they sent an email to leadership at major banks with this bankrolling bigotry. Now, bankrolling bigotry report warns that retail platforms like Amazon, cryptocurrency websites, subscription websites, crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe, and Facebook donations, they're allowing these hate groups to raise money. The report urges the platforms to cut off the spigot, to essentially debank these organizations that are engaged in wrongthink. The report urges Congress to consider making hate groups ineligible for tax-exempt status. So the Alliance Defending Freedom, they might be a 501c3. They want to take away that tax-exempt status so they can cut off the spigot, because they're, after all, a hate group, according to ISD Global. And again, this is called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Now, also another element to this is, who is ISD Global? So I went to their About Us page here, and it's worth just going over some of the partners for this group, ISD, which generated the bankrolling bigotry report, which was disseminated to the United States Treasury Department, which was handed out to banking institutions and Amazon and GoFundMe at the insistence of the Biden administration, per this document that was finally declassified by Tulsi Gabbard. We've gone now multiple hops. Now, who is ISD? ISD partners with the World Economic Forum. They partner with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They partner with the National Democratic Institute, which supports funding Ukraine, and has Stacey Abrams on the board of directors. Open Society Foundation. That's George Soros. Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Spotify, and YouTube. So Amazon and Facebook essentially help to finance a report which could be then laundered back to them to justify the fact that they're going to debank American citizens who engage in what they label as hate groups, groups that fight for pro-marriage, traditional marriage, maybe are against an illegal alien invasion at the southern border. That's hateful, after all. And the two big ones were the Department of Homeland Security and the United States State Department. Those are departments of the US government who partner with ISD Global. Those are departments of the US government that your tax dollars went to, that they then turned around and took those dollars, gave it to ISD Global to write this bankrolling bigotry report, which was given back to another department, Department of Treasury, which then was laundered to banking institutions and other platforms in order to encourage them to not do business with you, the American citizen. You're funding your own demise. Now, I want to go to the next one, which again is from the DNI. Funds are prioritized based on DT threats being pursued. FBI and DOJ should regularly review domestic terrorism funding allocations and work with the National Security Council and the Office of Management and Budget to address any emerging issues. We just want to make sure that we're putting the right amount of money and personnel and manpower and hours devoted towards the actual threat to the country. Now, that would comport with the fact that we might be reassigning agents in the FBI from child pornography, child exploitation, human trafficking investigations to do other more important work, the kind of work that is career caseworthy. Our 9/11, January 6th, 2021. Let's take it out of the J6 context. Maybe you should be surveilling parents at school board meetings, which did happen, and I can testify to. In fact, I think I actually did testify to that.
Mr. Friend, you ever been to a school board meeting?
Yes, I have.
FBI ever sent you to the parking lot of a school board meeting?
Yes, they have.
And in the parking lot of a school board meeting where the FBI sent you, you were taking down information regarding people's license plates.
That's correct.
Now, it wasn't the first time you'd been to a school board meeting, was it?
No, I went on my own as a private citizen.
As a parent.
Yes.
And so there you were. It must have been quite an interesting perspective. There you were taking down the information of people, parents attending school board meetings on behest of the FBI, and you had been one of those parents at a school board meeting. How did that feel?
Well, after I attended privately, my colleagues teased me that they were probably going to start investigating me.
You used to go after the worst of the worst, didn't you?
Yes, I believe so.
You went after people who looked at child porn,
Yes.
people who were sexually exploiting children,
Yes.
and then you were in the parking lot of a school board meeting, taking down the information of parents. What happened to the cases that you were working to protect our communities from the worst predators that exist?
I was told they were not to be resourced, and then after I was suspended, they were handed off to local law enforcement. That's exactly what happened. The FBI told me that child pornography was not a priority. Give those cases to local deputies and police officers. You're not working on that anymore. You have to work on domestic terrorism, and the only cases we happen to have are January 6th. That was comporting with this playbook that we finally got from DNI, and it doesn't stop there. Now we're moving on to Pillar 3. Ensure that federal law enforcement has sufficient personnel resources to counter the evolving DT threat, including whether additional non-intelligence program funding should be requested from Congress or whether an amendment to Executive Order 12333 would be appropriate to allow a revised NIP methodology. NIP is the National Intelligence Program. That includes domestic terrorism positions and resources. 12333. Executive Order 12333, we've talked about before with George Hill. And this was reported in Wired magazine in the very latter days of the Obama administration. It's an executive order that, due to the amendment that Barack Obama issued, that Wired magazine, which leans hard left, was very concerned about, it was going to allow unfettered access between what the NSA was able to collect, whatever they were able to hoover up between signals intelligence. You send an email, you make a phone call, the NSA collects on it. They do that looking outward at outward threats. But then they're all collected into a giant data warehouse. And because of 12333, that executive order, now the FBI can access that without a warrant. They can just go in there and shop for whatever they want. I mentioned the NDI, and I'll throw this up just because I did the research on it. The NDI, working for democracy, making democracy work. Now, we want to go and move on to another, I don't know, I feel like fact that the American Radicals podcast exists to share this information, has existed for a long time. And we'll go back to the iconography. This is being reported in DNI. Incorporate DT-focused information, including information on domestic terrorism, iconography, symbology, and phraseology into existing resources, including the Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team, First Responders Toolbox product line, and the DOJ's State and Local Anti-Terrorism Training Handbook on Law Enforcement Intelligence. Now, who remembers when it was revealed by a whistleblower that there was this symbols guide that was percolated around? I think there was a whistleblower. I think there was a whistleblower who actually testified to that to Congress. I think that whistleblower is not here today, but he typically is. This is GOB Actual.
Order is recognized.
So which Americans were being targeted? Now, August 2nd, 2022, a media organization obtained a copy of a document which whistleblowers subsequently authenticated to the committee that is styled the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Symbols Guide on Militia Violent Extremists. Mr. Boyle, are you generally familiar with that guide?
Yes.
And that guide identified certain things that made people more likely to be deemed a threat or terrorists, didn't it?
Yes.
And wasn't one of those things just the number 2 and the letter A next to each other?
Yes, it was.
And in your experience as a law enforcement official, does putting the word 2 or the letter 2 and A next to each other make someone more likely to be violent or law-breaking?
No.
And if someone signified the right, that they support the right to bear arms, was that also something in the symbol guide?
Yes.
And how about, this one really got me, the Betsy Ross flag. Was the Betsy Ross flag in the terrorism symbol guide?
It was.
And what about the Betsy Ross flag makes someone more likely to be a violent extremist?
I wish there was a reasonable explanation for that question.
There isn't. And people blew the whistle and said, this stuff is crazy. Americans are being targeted.
Garrett is always on point. He was one of the whistleblowers that brought that forward. I actually have a copy of this symbols guide. Throw that up, and you can see there, there's the Don't Tread on Me Gadsden flag. There's the Blood of Liberty, the Betsy Ross flag, 2A, the Punisher logo, which is hysterical because the Punisher logo is essentially on every single SWAT team's shoulder. All of these were referenced as potential symbols of militia violent extremism, which is an outgrowth, it's a subcategory of domestic violent extremists, which is domestic terrorism. And because of the Patriot Act, the FBI can open an assessment on you for an articulable purpose, maybe that you have a Gadsden flag flying outside of your house. Full assessment can be opened without even having to rely on a supervisor for 30 days. And then the supervisor approves it, extended, and then we have a quota system and we have to keep it open. Another one coming from DNI. Enable U.S. government insider threat programs to identify and mitigate threats, including potential domestic terrorism-related activities. Consider policy recommendations to address defined prohibited activities among uniformed military personnel, civilian employees, and contractors. Now, the FBI, as the suspendables revealed, updated its insider threat training a couple of years ago. They used to be separate. They used to have a whistleblower training where it talked to you about 5 USC 2303, how to bring forward a reasonable concern of waste, fraud, abuse, a violation of policy, procedure, or law, a risk to the public safety, and bring that information forward to your supervisor or a member of your chain of command, to the Office of the Special Counsel, the Office of the Inspector General, to a member of Congress. There's a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it. They wanted to make sure that you knew about it. And then separately, there was insider threat training. That is Robert Hansen. That's someone who has access to delicate information that could be vulnerable and recruited by a bad actor like a nation state like Russia, and they might provide that information. So they tell you to look for red flags. You know, somebody always kind of short on cash, and then now all of a sudden they're really flush? Are they going through maybe a difficult time in their marriage that might render them emotionally vulnerable? It could be a honeypot sort of scenario. But the FBI saw fit to combine insider threat training with whistleblower training. And from the comment section, which you actually can do in the FBI training, the overwhelming consensus was that this training was sending a chilling effect because it was labeling whistleblowing as an insider threat. Again, comports really well with what the DNI exposed. Now we've got one more that I was able to pull out from the DNI declassified document. Rein in the proliferation of ghost guns, encourage state adoption of extreme risk protection orders, and drive other executive and legislative action, including banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. It's always a gun grab. The communists always go for the firearms, and that was the one excerpt that got a lot of mainstream media very fired up about. But again, this is something that we've talked about before. They went ahead and did it. Now, this was from Dave Yost, the Ohio Attorney General. And he was pushing back on an effort to essentially go after guns. This is the DOJ's National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. This is very, very government speak. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost and 18 other state attorneys general opposed a new federal program that promotes aggressive enforcement of red flag gun confiscation laws. That's basically where the government can take your guns preemptively. Yost and his counterparts argue in the letter to the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland that the National Extreme Risk Protection Order, ERPO, Resource Center, launched in March by Department of Justice, undermines the Second Amendment and other fundamental rights in a flawed attempt to reduce gun violence. State attorneys general raised several concerns with this resource center, most notably how the program advocates for laws that allow the government to suspend fundamental rights under the Second Amendment with no due process. Due process be damned. After all, we have to counter the threat of domestic terrorism. We have to counter the threat of anti-government extremism. So we have to suspend the Second Amendment. And we're just implementing this order that came down. This was the playbook. Now, I do want to throw this up because this is an additional document that I've referenced before. And again, I will put this in the comment section or in the show notes because it is publicly available. Now that Tulsi Gabbard has declassified this playbook, I do want to make sure I tie it to something else that is a matter of public record and interesting timing on it, because this one is a combined document from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. It's called a Strategic Intelligence Assessment and Data on Domestic Terrorism. They've actually give these out annually, but this one comes from May of 2021, just after the document that we've been covering down on today was authored and proliferated around the government. And in this document, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security defined what is called an anti-government or anti-authority violent extremist. They say that this threat encompasses the potentially unlawful use of threat or force of violence in furtherance of an ideological agenda derived from anti-government, anti-authority sentiment. And that sentiment, according to Joe Biden's FBI and Department of Homeland Security, is opposition to perceived economic, social, or racial hierarchies or perceived government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. So we have to make sure that we combine it with white supremacy, of course, right? That's the throwaway. But the latter portion, perceived government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. That's an or. It's an either or. It's not an and also. So is a perception that requiring me to inject an experimental gene juice in my arm in order to have employment might constitute government overreach? That would find you in the crosshairs of a agave, anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist, domestic terrorist organization. Maybe you think that the federal government could have been negligent by allowing 20, 30, 40, 50 million illegal aliens to come across the border. Again, you would be a potential domestic terrorist, according to the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. Perhaps you had questions about an election outcome where they said at midnight that one candidate won, and then we all went to bed, and then somehow at 4 o'clock in the morning, the other candidate won. Again, illegitimacy. you're an anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist who needs to be investigated as a potential domestic terrorist. And we have on this program talked at length about the FBI playbook. I'm tying this all together. The playbook being we find a vulnerable person, we groom them, we facilitate them deciding to do their worst ideas. And how do we do that? Well, one, we know that they're vulnerable because they're low intelligence, they're financially indigent, down on their luck. Maybe they're just emotionally disturbed increasingly. Maybe they're a juvenile. And then we introduce the confidential human source, the snitch, eventually an online covert employee or an undercover employee. And you groom that person. And once they agree to do their worst ideas, because after all, you've identified them as a potential domestic terrorist, the presumption is in national security that you are guilty until proven innocent. The case has to remain open until we can, beyond any shadow of a doubt, demonstrate that you, in fact, are not a terrorist. And then when that vulnerable person agrees to do something, whether just further cements in our mind that they were always guilty. They always had that intent, even if they were not predisposed or even capable of doing anything violent of their really bad ideas. And I'm not contradicting the fact that they could have really bad ideas, as many emotionally disturbed people do. Now, I say all that as build up for something that I pulled from the archives of the Department of Justice, where they talk about entrapment and outrageous government conduct. Because if you are comporting with what the DNI document showed us all about how we want to push back on domestic terrorism and everyone is guilty until proven innocent, well, then you can certainly engage in conduct as long as it's not, as the DOJ categorizes it or qualifies it as, outrageous conduct. And the DOJ itself tells you what they consider to be outrageous and not outrageous. The Supreme Court has never held that the government's mere use of undercover agents or informants, or the use of deception by them, so i.e. lying to the person and telling them that they can help them do their worst ideas, that is a due process violation. That's not, according to the Supreme Court, according to the Department of Justice. No court of appeals has held that a predisposed defendant may establish a due process violation. Again, the presumption is that you're predisposed. The presumption is that you were always guilty, simply because he purportedly was induced to commit the crime by an undercover agent or informant. Don't you see? You were always guilty. The informant and the undercover just flesh that out, even if it takes them years. Finally, defendants who claim to be victims of outrageous government conduct sometimes argue that the district court should dismiss the indictment in the exercise of its supervisory power. In the absence of a due process violation, however, the district court has no authority to dismiss an indictment on this basis. So not only did they entrap you, the DOJ and the FBI say that it didn't violate your due process, ergo, you cannot appeal to the district court to say that I was entrapped because you were always predisposed. You were always guilty. Our presupposition was correct. We just, over a course of 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, were able to get you to agree to do your worst idea because we have to counter domestic terrorism. So I hope this was enlightening. I hope that episode 202 of the American Radicals podcast sort of did the deep dive that I was hoping to get from most of the media last week, but nobody really wanted to do the homework on it because this was how they did it, folks. This was the playbook that we saw on full display during the Joe Biden administration. They were happy to identify vulnerable people. They were happy to identify people who they deemed to be engaging in wrongthink, engaging in First Amendment protected activity that is on its face not criminal. Certainly sitting outside of an abortion clinic and praying is not terrorist activity. And yet the playbook was set and it was proliferated around to every arm of the federal government. And it was used to go after you, if you like the Second Amendment, you, if you had a beef with the government being a little bit too large. If, say, you were a person in the military and had actually sworn an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, you know, you probably like the guns too much. We're going to go after you. And they had the cover of not just policy, but of DOJ long-standing policy that they would facilitate and groom and get the worst actors in order to support the narrative. And then they would stand principals up, like the Attorney General of the United States and the President of the United States, to lie to your face after they had manipulated individuals and also manipulated the way that cases were carried forward in order to push forward a fake and false narrative that you were a terrorist if you happen to oppose your government, which is your right as an American citizen. Now, as we're rounding it out today, I want to make sure that I do leave you with the party thought. Now, Garrett is not here. I'm going to do my best, though, to maybe insert a biblical worldview. And I pulled 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 48 and 49. This is David and Goliath, but we're not going to talk about the 5 smooth stones. I want to talk about something else. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Now, verse 48 says that David ran quickly towards the battle line. This is a kid who walked up to an army of grown men and said, "Is anyone going to do anything?" And they said, "Nope." And he said, "Well, I'm going to pull a Thanos and put on my gauntlet, and I guess I'll just have to do it myself." And he was patient until it was time to be active. And when he was active, he ran to it. And I think that's important for what we're talking about today. We have been patient. We've waited for this revelation to come out. And now we have to run to the battle. Now we have to hold the people that did this accountable. It is not time to sit back and rest on your laurels. It is not time to say, well, we won an election. We can't lose a battle we aren't willing to fight. Now is the time to push, to get aggressive, and to run to the face of the battle. Now, hopefully, this information that has come out will galvanize people to have an appetite for it. We will certainly, on the American Radicals podcast, insist on pressing forward, and hopefully you can do the same. Hopefully, you got something out of today, and hopefully you can share it with a friend. And if there was a lot there, I know I threw a lot at you pretty quickly, go back and listen to it again. I think that I put probably 3 to 4 hours of research into this, and it was a 15-page document. But again, as I alluded to in the beginning, this is why the American Radicals podcast exists. When I look back at the serendipity of the fact that we talked about many of these things before, I was able to tie up the loose ends on that and able to connect it to things that we've been talking about for years. And I will not leave you without a palate cleanse for the today, which is fun, and it is a biblical worldview. So I'm going to give you a double dose of it today. We didn't have Garrett, but maybe this will fill in his stead.
But I just got blessed with a good wife. Not every guy has a good wife. Sorry. I mean, think about Job in the Old Testament. Think about Job's wife. She must have been a real piece of work. I mean, the devil took everything from Job, man. Killed his kids, killed his servants, killed his livestock, covered Job in boils and sores. But his wife did not die. That's saying something right there, isn't it? Like, hey, devil, Job's wife's right over there.
That's not very nice, but it is funny. All right, guys. Appreciate your time and attention today. As always, the American Radicals podcast will be back with you on Saturday, 10:30 Eastern time here, rumble.com/amradpod. Have a great day. And until then, guys, appreciate it as always.
You've been listening to the voice of the Suspendables on the American Radicals podcast. Follow us on rumble.com/amradpod.